Welcome to another episode of Growth Hacker TV. I'm Bronson Taylor, and today I have Brian Balfour with us. Brian, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me.
I know you're super busy, you got a lot going on, so I know it's hard to make time for things like this, but we really do appreciate it.
It's fun teaching people about this growth stuff. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm glad you think it is, so you can come on here and teach away. Let's talk about you a little bit. You're a serial entrepreneur, and in a minute we'll kind of get into that more. But for right now, tell us a little bit about your current company, or I should say companies, and tell us what it means to be an entrepreneur in residence at Trinity.
I really don't have a company right now. So the EIR roles at venture firms are really sort of great transition roles for entrepreneurs who are kind of rolling off of their last gigs, kind of need some downtime to sort of explore the world and bring their heads up from being, heads down for so long. So the EIR role at Trinity Ventures, who's one of the top venture capital firms here in the Valley that focuses on consumer as well as enterprise Series A type stuff, was just a great place to do that. They see a ton of great companies. They work with a ton of great entrepreneurs. Right now it's been really about getting a broad view of the world, helping out as many entrepreneurs as I can, and really figuring out what company I want to start next.
Yeah, do you find yourself getting antsy, ready to get back in the game? I know for an entrepreneur, it's hard to be on the sidelines, right?
I've talked to so many people in this EIR sort of transition state, and it seems like everybody has their own little timeline. For me, I rolled off of my last company back in late August of 2012. So I've been in this transition period for about 5 or 6 months. So I am now I'm ready to roll on something.
Yeah.
Like I'm ready to have that thing and really go after it. But I really didn't feel that way until 2 months ago. It took me some time to sort of wind down and relax a little bit, and then sort of wind back up.
Absolutely. Startups can really take it out of you. I'm sure the people watching this will understand that. But
Yeah.
if you're not involved in a startup, it can drain you like few things in the universe can.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about your past a little bit. You really are a true serial entrepreneur. And according to your blog, here's your track record so far. And I love this quote. It says, you've been a co-founder of 4 companies in the past 10 years, 2 VC-backed, 1 angel-backed, 1 bootstrapped, 2 acquired, 1 shut down, 1 to be determined.
Yeah.
I like that you have such a broad experience because I really want to get into your head and try to figure out how you see marketing kind of big picture. You're going to have a perspective that the first time CMO is not going to have because you've seen it. You've been there as a founder, as a CMO. You've seen it with VC, with Bootstrap, with angel money. You have a lot more experience to kind of pull from. So let me ask you a few questions that you can kind of pull from that experience to answer. How do you think marketing has evolved in the past decade? Specifically within your ventures, what was it like from the first one into the last one in August? You said, how different is it now?
Man, that's a big question. And I guess one thing I should add to that is my past companies have been, I've done both B2B as well as B2C. I've done 3 technology, sort of 1 brick and mortar. So it's certainly varied across the board. But in terms of what's changed in the past decade, I guess let's break it up into a couple. Let's first talk a little bit macro, and then let's break it up into a couple different pieces. I think at a macro level, we've gone, at least in this startup ecosystem, we've gone. We went through this period where we had this mantra of product is everything, and a lot of that was caused by sort of putting kind of Facebook and Twitter and others on a pedestal and say, hey, if you build a great product, people will come. And it was weird because I always stood on the sidelines of that stuff and looked at it and said, I don't know, I kind of think distribution's pretty important.
Yeah, call me crazy, but
yeah. And so I think that, especially over the last year as, and it's being caused by a number of things, is that I think the pendulum is definitely has swung back in the other direction of from this product is everything to, oh crap, distribution's important too. And I think this is why we see sort of the terms like growth hacker and things like what you guys are doing becoming very important. And so I think just from a macro perspective of what we've seen have changed, I think we've definitely seen that change. So I guess like let's break it down a little bit. So on the consumer side, I might people might not agree with me here, but I actually don't think much has changed when you really think about it. So I think in consumer technology, it's just been very cyclical. And it's been cyclical around the evolution of new channels. And so, the specific techniques around those channels have certainly changed, but from a macro perspective, it really hasn't. So we go through this cycle of a new channel like Facebook will launch, and then out of the consumer categories, the really common ones, online dating, gaming, travel, communication, whatever it might be, you always see a new wave of startups that pop up, and they pop up because they're riding the back of this new channel. And so, I think, it's always been about the same thing of like, look at what the new channels are, build your product to integrate well with whatever that new channel is, and sort of ride that wave. And I think we're going to continue to see that. We just saw this wave go through with mobile. I think a lot of low-hanging fruit has been taken out of mobile, and eventually we'll see a whole nother new platform pop up. Who knows what it'll be, but we'll see a whole new wave, that same wave happen again. B2B, I think, is different. In the B2B, I think we're seeing a lot bigger changes where, the past couple years where we've seen this whole trend of like consumerization for the enterprise, it's dramatically changed like what a CMO and what a marketing team does in a B2B environment, where they're using consumer techniques to basically get their foot in the door, and then they use like an inside sales team to close. And so that has enabled B2B to do a few things. One, it's made inside sales teams far more efficient than our predecessors. It's made sales cycles smaller. And as a result of those two things, you end up being able to both scale faster as well as attack a lower price point, which opens up different pieces of the market. And so I think you've seen B2B evolve a ton. And I would look at, startups that are doing it really well are, guys like New Relic and sort of the developer tool space. HubSpot. Oh my God, like HubSpot has done an amazing job at it. And so like I said, I think in the B2B, we've it's changed very, very dramatically to what we saw 10 years ago.
Yeah, what you're saying I think is really insightful, and honestly I've never really thought about it that way, because in the 90s and early 2000s, when you sold into the enterprise, there was all this psychology about how high up on the food chain do you go, how do you break in, how do you make a sale, and there was all this best practices around that. But now you really do see the consumerization of it, and it's kind of a bottom up. You can get in, Dropbox is being used in enterprise on accident because people are bringing it into the enterprise, things like that. Right. So that's smart. And you also said with the consumer to consumer stuff, how there's just a new channel, people jump on it, they figure out how to integrate with it. Do you think that there's always going to be a new channel? Because I look at Facebook and it feels like the ads are performing less and less well. I look at Twitter and it's like eventually I'm going to feel that way about Twitter in a couple of years. Like the ad is just, it's not going to give me the ROI that I wanted. And then at some point it's like, is there enough room for another Twitter, another Facebook, another anything? I mean, at some point, do we just run out of channels and then all the marketers are sitting around just stuck, having like nowhere to go? What do you think?
I've thought less about that and more about a different problem.
What's that?
Which worries me more, actually, as an entrepreneur. So what you see is let's focus on a single channel. You see the channel evolve. So you have this macro cycle, right? And then within each channel, there's sort of this mini cycle where at first you'll see basically the big companies, the category companies, the travel, the dating, the communication, the gaming, like I said, the first wave of them tend to be like spammy type startups. So if people remember the early days of Facebook, all of the quiz and the really early Facebook games, right? And they get a bunch of traction. But then a new category emerges. So basically the the space starts to get crowded and the acquisition costs start to go up, and so it starts to price them out of the market, and so you end up with a new wave of startups that tend to build deeper, more engaging products that focus on the general audience, and so that they can support these like higher acquisition costs. And so in the Facebook world, that was things like Zynga and gaming and Zoosk and dating, right? Things of that nature. And then after that, since that brings up the acquisition costs even more, people look to how to compete, and so they end up looking at niches. And so when you focus on a very targeted segment, you tend to be able to go much deeper, monetize much higher, and therefore support the acquisition costs that way. And so in Facebook, we saw that in social gaming with guys like Kixeye and Kabam, which focused on the mid-core market that monetized much higher, and they could, outcompete Zynga on, Facebook ads and stuff like that. And then after that, you see sort of people look to compete even more, and then they move to like international waters, and so they focus on international countries and stuff where there might be not as much competition.
Yeah.
So this cycle plays out whether it's Facebook or whether it's mobile, or like let's go like way back in like just like the early like internet, and it was just like a wide open wild west. This cycle, the thing that worries me is that I'm observing is that every time a new channel evolves, that cycle is becoming shorter and shorter. And so as an entrepreneur, you've got to be like crazy fast, right? You got to be crazy fast to jump onto these opportunities and take advantage of them before everything gets, before all of the advantage kind of gets competed away. Yeah. So that's the thing that I've been worried about most. Whether there's, whether there's going to be more channels and stuff, that's hard to say. I mean, I kind of look at history and say, I think we probably would have rolled back like 5 or 6 years. We probably would have been asking ourselves the same question, and now in hindsight, like we look completely dumb. Yeah. So my guess is that just with the changing landscape of like new devices and new hardware and new screens, and maybe it's Google Glass or maybe it's something else, right? There's
Apple probably Watch. Who knows?
I would more place my bet on there's going to be a new channel and be more concerned about how quickly I have to move as an entrepreneur to really take advantage of it.
Yeah, that's awesome advice for anybody listening to this. Another thing I'm kind of interested to pick your brain about is because you've had angel money, because you've been bootstrapped, and because you've accepted VC money, how does that change the game in terms of customer acquisition? When you have VC money, is it just 10x easier, or is it really the same thing you're doing? I mean, because I haven't had it from both perspectives. Is it easier with VC money or no?
Yeah, it is hard no matter what you do. I think VCs give you VC money helps you in a couple of directions. So first of all, you have to assume that you're operating in a big enough market, solving a big enough problem. When you have VC money, it helps you in two ways. At the earliest stages, it basically helps you learn faster. So you can spend money unprofitably for the sake of getting users in the system to learn about other things that are more important, like retention and virality and monetization, those things are going to inform you about what your long-term growth strategy is going to be. And so bootstrapping, that's very, very difficult to do. But with VC money, it helps you sort of do that. So that's the big advantage of having money at the early stage. In the later stages, it typically solves this cash flow problem that you run into. So at the earliest stages, startups typically recover their acquisition costs on a per user basis in about 3 months or less. That's actually what I would look for in a business. But over time, people acquire all the low-hanging fruit out of the market, and you typically need to spend more money to keep growing, to increase your market size. So the time to recover those acquisition costs ends up becoming longer and longer as you grow a business. And you can see that now, like Salesforce, for example, they spend about a year or a year and a half. It takes them a year and a half to recover their costs. That's fine got the cash to basically be able to fund those acquisition costs and solve that cash flow problems. And two, they know that their LTV is like a few years or more. And so I think that's where cash really helps you. And if you don't have like VC money in those later stages, you're sort of restricted to the market that you can, the piece of the market that allows you to recover costs in a quick enough manner that you don't have cash flow problems. So I think that's where the two places that it definitely helps. But I wouldn't call it 10x easier. It's any business is hard to figure out like how to grow aggressively.
Yeah. Would you ever bootstrap again after being an EIR and after having VC money, or is it just a much better path in your opinion?
I tend to look at it the other way, and I would suggest this to entrepreneurs because I know there's like some people who are kind of maniacal about bootstrapping, and I actually don't.
It becomes a religion.
It does become a religion, and they sort of tout these things of like, I don't want to give control away of my business, and like I don't want to deal with these assholes, right? The fact of the matter is if you raise money correctly from the right people, it can be a phenomenal experience. And so I just look at that as excuses. But I would actually say, don't worry about that. I would say first, entrepreneurs, like figure out an idea or a problem that you're really in love with, and then back into, and be honest with yourself about what is the best way to build and grow this business. Because I think a lot of people aren't in both directions. Like some people fall in love with this concept, and then they fall in love with the vanity of raising money and stuff, and they try to fit those two together when it might be a great problem and a great business, but it might not be a venture capital backed business. And it works the other way too, right? Like some people try to bootstrap something that they should just probably raise money for. So that's kind of how I look at it. I think most of the ideas that I'm considering now are definitely ones that are better suited for raising some capital. But that just tends to be kind of where my mind sort of wanders at the moment.
Yeah, I love how balanced your view on it is. You don't decide what you're going to do before you actually understand the entire endeavor. You have to understand, like, what is it going to take to pull this off, and then just make wise decisions at every turn, not coming into it already predetermined. I know the way it has to be. I think that's good advice for any entrepreneur. Let's give some actionable advice that'll be able to help our audience a little bit, because the people coming to these interviews, they want to learn from specific things you've done in the past, especially somebody like you that has so much experience. What's been some of your biggest wins in terms of customer acquisition or growth? And maybe you can't give exact numbers. I know a lot of NDAs float around and whatnot. But what are some of the things that you've done where you said, okay, I'm going to do this, you did it, it worked out extremely well, and maybe we can learn from that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think some like growth is just so specific to businesses, they might not be able to learn exactly, and I can talk
That's
about
okay, they're still interested, I promise.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll tell you a few stories of different degrees. So my first company ever was a college-specific social network before Facebook and MySpace existed. And there was a ton of those, so we were like one of 100 stories. At that time I knew nothing. I was dumb. I was 19, and I was making every mistake in the book. And we were trying to figure out how to, grow users and all that kind of stuff. And at one point, I think we just decided to get our hands dirty and go brute force. And there was like one night on our college campuses, University of Michigan, where we just plastered the campus, chalking the sidewalks, filling every lecture hall with like flyers. A student could not get to their class without seeing our name at least 3 times.
Yeah.
And in the first 12 hours of doing that, we had like 1,500 users. And so we basically got in our cars and drove around to all of the college campuses in the Midwest and repeated that over and over and over again. And with that technique, I think we got to like 30,000 users in 30 days. And back then, which right now with like the Facebook platform and stuff is but back in 2003, that was pretty great. So the big lesson from that is, that I try to tell people is like in the earliest stages, sometimes don't be afraid to use brute force. Not everything has to be, Facebook viral growth, right? Like you're just really looking for traction in the early days. So that's the first story. Second story was Viximo, which was a social gaming distribution platform. So we basically took games that worked really well on Facebook, and we distributed it to about 20 different international sites. Or that's what we evolved into. That's not how we started out. And there, we grew that from 0 to tens of millions of users across our gaming network in less than a year. And we did that through two methods. We did it through first partnerships. So we partnered with all of these sites and we brought something very valuable to them, which was high quality monetizing games that they couldn't get on their own. And then second, we did B2C optimization techniques on all of the different sites. So putting the games on the sites would get us a certain flow of users, and then we would optimize it to get even more users. The amazing story about that was we went from nothing to like a couple $1 million in yearly run rate in like 48 hours. And this was after trying like 5 or 6 different sites. And then all of a sudden we combined the right game with the right site, and it just like went off. And from that experience, I really learned I think we weren't as methodical about the combination testing between games and sites that we could have been. We kind of just got lucky. If we would have been more methodical about it, I think we would have learned much quicker about what works and what didn't work. And been able, but like once we found like what works, we were able to repeat it over and over again. So there's the second. And then the third was, Boundless basically developed a free alternative to students like $200 textbooks. And the big lesson from this is that big numbers and volume is not always sort of the big win. And so our big challenge in the early stages of this was like, there were alternatives for like about 3 college textbooks. And there's thousands of different college textbooks. So we had to be super, super targeted with our money and our resources to target students that we knew we had an alternative for. And the big win in that was that we got in the first couple weeks, we had, probably about 10,000 targeted users. That it was like searching for needles in a haystack. That was like a combination of two things, is that we selected our channels correctly, right? So we used medium and long tail search techniques where we could get really targeted. And once again, I went back to my brute force days from my earliest thing, and we did a lot of on-campus marketing. We would actually research the classes that we knew had the books that we had alternatives for and target those specific classes.
That's awesome.
And so I think in that case, once again, it's like, it's not necessarily about big numbers, but it's about like who you're getting in the door as well. And that comes down to selecting your channels very, very wisely.
Yeah, that's incredible, actionable advice. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that people need to hear. There's different ways to attack it. There's different things that work. Let me ask you this. You're an angel investor. When somebody comes to you with an idea, which I'm sure happens often, what do you look at when you consider the growth potential? Because I know that's the way you're eyeing it up as a CMO kind of guy. You're thinking, all right, does this thing have potential, or is it pie in the sky? Are you looking at the CMO? Are you looking at the founder? Are you looking at the market? Are you looking at the traction they already have? Is it a combination of all those? What kind of key metrics really get your attention when you're looking at a possible investment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the stage. So I think at the earliest stages, like for angel type stuff, I'm not looking at any sort of metrics or anything. Most angel deals, you're really taking a bet on the team and the market and the rough concept. Any quote unquote traction that they have, it doesn't. More than that, it doesn't imply growth. And there's a big difference between traction and growth. Which
explain that to us.
So in the earliest days of a startup, you're never looking for growth. You're looking for traction. And in traction, what you're optimizing for, it's less about optimization and more about just establishing a steady stream of users and customers into your product so that you can figure out the other variables in the growth equation, which are things like activation, retention, referral, lifetime value, stuff like, things of that nature. Yeah. And the big thing is that there's a lot of different ways to get traction. Press, doing blog posts, guest blog posts, using like alternative, advertising channels like Reddit, some of the brute force stuff I was talking about, like in-person marketing. But the fact is that there are only very few scalable growth channels. There's really 5. There's search, there's display, there's Facebook, there's viral/word of mouth, how you ever want to bucket that, and there's sales. That's pretty much the only scalable channels. Press is not a scalable.
It's a blip strategy on the radar. It doesn't scale.
It's a blip on the radar. So at some point, you've got to figure out how to play in one of those 5 channels.
Yeah.
But you don't necessarily have to figure out that out right at the beginning. There's lower cost, lower techniques that you can use to get traction. So once you're at the growth stage, you can take all of these, you should now have from your traction phase, like basically hypotheses around all of the variables in your growth equation, right? So you should have an equation, actual written out equation. And you can take those hypotheses around these different variables and start to basically optimize, the resource allocation that you put against, increasing these variables within these growth channels.
Yeah.
So I hopefully that makes sense. But they're 2 completely different phases of the company. And I guess the lowest bar you could say that probably people would say is that traction is product market fit, growth is post product market fit. I think that's simplifying it a little too much, but that's probably the best and easiest bar to sort of explain difference.
Just hearing you say that, it helps my understanding. I mean, I'm learning as you speak right now because I muddle the 2. Traction becomes growth, growth becomes traction, that kind of stuff. But what you just said, I think makes perfect sense, and it's probably one of the clearest ways I've heard it put.
So just in addition to that, so I think through Trinity and through Angel Deals, I get a lot of guys coming in saying, we're ready to grow this thing, right? And I'll ask them a couple questions about their retention and monetization, and realize there's huge holes in the grand equation of things. And we've seen this. Like, look at startups like Vidi, right? Like, they hit growth way too soon, and they peaked and they crashed, and that's because they didn't have the other pieces of their growth strategy, their growth funnel figured out before they turned down that growth machine, or Facebook turned it on for them. And so hopefully they recover and they figure it out and all that type of stuff. But you've got to, there's a time for traction and there's a time for growth, and I think they're 2 very different things.
And the traction seems to really be a learning phase, so you can figure out what you need to know so that the growth doesn't kill you, but it enables you.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of leads into a couple of the last questions I have here. Being at Trinity Ventures, I'm sure you see a lot of startups make a lot of the same mistakes. It's probably deja vu all over again for you, seeing the startups you see. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see them habitually make? You kind of already mentioned one is, they hit growth or want to hit growth when there's big holes in their monetization and retention strategy. Are there any other things that come to mind as just over and over you see this with startups?
Yeah, there's a few things that I feel like I repeat on a weekly basis, but so the traction versus growth is a great one. And the fact that there's very few scalable growth channels is another one. I think the other thing is that growth, a lot of people, hopefully people with this video, if you're not familiar with Dave McClure's, marketing funnel for pirates, right? Picturing that funnel of acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, referral. Once again, like a lot of people think about growth hacking, growth user acquisition as that top funnel, that acquisition piece. Like, how do I get more people in the top of the funnel?
Yeah.
And growth is really about looking at the whole funnel holistically, and that's why the best growth guys typically tend to be a mix between a product manager and a marketer. And the reason is because most businesses, like big businesses, they don't tend to build their long-term sustainable advantage at the acquisition piece of the funnel. If we go back to our earlier conversation about those cycles, right? Any technique or channel that you find at the top of the funnel over time will be competed away. And so if that's where you're competing in the grand scheme of things, you're playing this game of I've got to continue to find, more and more, new techniques that nobody else knows about that I can exploit. And that's not it. So most businesses actually find a way to monetize their customers, better than, their competitors, or retain them longer, or activate them at a much higher rate. And when you do that, it changes. It has like an equal effect. You basically change that CPA to LTV equation in your favor. And building sort of sustainable advantages at those pieces in the funnel is a lot stronger than constantly trying to find whatever the new technique or hole in the acquisition space is. So that's definitely one. And I think another thing is that, and part of the reason I kind of dislike the term growth hack,
but you can hate on it. That's fine.
is I think hack just is a lot of times misunderstood. It's misunderstood. It's misunderstood as like I'm like shooting from the hip, and it's this like magical creative process, and I'm just like throwing things together and sort of seeing what works without any sort of methodical thinking. And growth is the complete opposite of all of that. I hate to tell people, but some
growth
people when I say that,
planned.
it kind of is, right? Like, and there's really 3 steps of it, right? There's this framework of looking at growth as a full funnel item. Then there's starting to establish the growth equation, which is about figuring out the variables in your business that you can sort of optimize and tweak that have sort of big impact on your long term. And that's different for every single business. And then the third is how you establish a process and like a regular rhythm of, listing out all of the things you want to test. And each one of those tests is correlated with a specific, variable in that equation. And tracking sort of the results of all of those tests, just like an engineering process of like developing features, right? It's a very methodical process of, going through, this list of things against the variables that you think you have the biggest impact. So that's what I warn against. It's like, it's never this hack is all of a sudden going to change the game of your business. I think a lot of times it's positioned like that in the press, but usually it starts off with a deeper question, not like how do we grow, but it's like how do we, optimize this one variable better, right? And then that question leads to here are the ideas for product features or different things that might help with that type of stuff. And then I think the last thing is just be focused. Like the last thing I like to hear is when a startup comes to me and says, I ask them, how are they going to grow? And they list out 5 different channels to me. And the reality of the situation is that diversifying yourself across 5 different channels is sort of a death sentence. And there's so much you can do in one channel, in terms of strategy and optimization and copy testing and like all that kind of stuff that that you've got to be very diligent about evaluating the channel and choosing, and prioritizing it, your strong hypotheses, rather than trying to spread yourself thin and try like 7 at once and optimize all 7 at once. So be focused. The reality of the situation is that most startups, 80% of their growth is from one channel. Zynga was Facebook, Groupon was email, TripAdvisor was search, right? And it's just, it's very rare that you'll come across a business where they've, their growth has come equally from, 3 or more different channels. There's usually one predominant one. So figure out that one is and, focus like a hawk.
Absolutely. I have a feeling that this is going to be one of those interviews that people are going to watch over and over just to dissect it, hear it again, really figure it out. Because I feel like in response to every question, you've given us really insight into exactly the way we need to be thinking about growth, about CMOs, about that kind of thing. So let me end with this. It's been an incredible interview. What advice would you give to someone trying to break into growth, trying to become a CMO, or trying to grow a startup? Where should they begin? Should they get an internship? Should they just start something and learn as they go? Should they have one specific skill set they really mastered? And if so, what is it? Where would you tell somebody to begin if they're the 19-year-old Brian? Where should they start?
That's a good question. That's a great question. So I think, if you look at some of the great, growth guys and CMOs and stuff, they tend to be all shaped like a T, the letter T. So they're really deep. They go really deep on like one or two channels. And then they're sort of broad and like understand the mechanics across all of the other ones. So become like, once again, just like, trying to diversify your business across 5 different channels and optimize for all of them at once. Optimizing yourself across 5 different channels is really, really hard. So my best suggestion is, pick, the 1 or 2 channels that you think you might be really interested in. And probably the best, is, you could probably either pick something very established like search, which will be around for forever, or you can take a bet on something that's emerging like mobile. That's such a massively changing landscape right now. Like getting in early and really understanding that from an early process might be very valid. But pick those 1 or 2 channels and try to go really deep on it. But then take the time to understand sort of the broad surface level like other pieces. So, and those other pieces are things like like copywriting and basic statistics and math, as well as what are the differences, the advantages and disadvantages of the varying channels. Because most CMOs, what'll happen is you'll start off small in a small company. The CMO will be very tactical and they'll be focused on that one channel that they're really deep in. But as the company grows, they'll bring in precise experts to grow into some of those other channels. And that CMO isn't actually tactically doing it, but they need to understand it from from a broader perspective. So some good, get inside a company that's fast growing, that's very metrics focused. Some of the best places to learn are actually lead generation companies. Yeah. These guys are always on the bleeding, even though like some of them hit the gray areas in terms of business tactics. They are always on the bleeding edge of the latest techniques, and they're very mathematical. Most of them are operating on extremely slim margins, and so that could be a great place to learn. There's growth teams forming in startups everywhere. I would look specifically for those types of roles, but make sure whoever is sort of leading that team. It's just like anything, you're going to learn more if you've got a phenomenal teacher. So focus more on the teacher than the actual startup. So I think that's the basic stuff. And there's so much information coming out about this stuff now through programs like this, and just like I dig on Quora, and SEO Moz does a ton of really interesting data analysis, and they do a ton of stuff. And then, one last thing. I know I'm rambling a bit.
You can ramble as long as you want. It's good stuff coming out.
One of the best things that I've ever done is I established a growth group. So basically, when I was in Boston, myself and another friend got together. Some of the best user acquisition and CMO types. Small, private. It wasn't meant to be a big thing. The point was to establish honesty and trust, and we basically used that group, and once a month somebody would come with a presentation prepared of some things that they had tried in their business. They exposed the data and the metrics, right? Because the big part about a lot of this stuff is that a lot of this stuff is so data that a lot of time is very private stuff, and so it's very hard to get people to open up about it. But establishing that small group of trusted people who are also testing and playing around with all of this stuff is one of the best ways to learn and get the inside track on things that you might not have time to try out. So that's one of the other I probably learned the most from those growth groups than I have from anything else.
Wow, I've never even heard of that before, and that's such great advice. I'm trying to think right now who I can get in my in my growth group, and who I'm going to go meet with and what I'm going to talk about. That's a great idea. Well, Brian, this has been an incredible interview. Again, I know you're busy, so taking 45 minutes out for us is really a treat. And the stuff you've said is gold today for anybody paying attention. So thank you again, Brian.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to has questions or wants to email me, just look at my website. It's brianbalfour.com. My contact info is on there. Feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to help.
Absolutely. And right below this interview will be all your links and a little bio about Brian. So right below this interview will be persistent links. Click on those. Go find out more about him and follow up with him. As you can see, he knows quite a bit. Thanks again, Brian.
All right. Thank you. Have a good one.